Good afternoon. I have two statements to make. The first statement is can be reported in real time, but after that I'm going to make a statement about legislation that will be introduced in the legislature this afternoon, and that will be on an embargoed basis just out of respect for the Legislative Assembly and its rules. But let me first of all start with some very good news. Today the National Bank announced that their projection that Alberta will lead Canada in economic and job growth, projecting a 6% increase in Alberta's gross domestic product this year and a 4.6% increase in the number of jobs in our economy. They join the Bank of Montreal and the Conference Board of Canada that made similar projections about economic growth last week for the year 2021. So we're going to do everything we can to live up to and even exceed the growing optimism about growth and jobs returning to Alberta's economy in a big way. I want to address today's announcement by Rogers Communications and Shaw Industries, who announced a proposed merger which has significant implications for Alberta's economy. Obviously, their proposal is subject to assessment and approval by federal regulatory agencies, particularly the Competition Bureau and the Canadian Radio and Television Commission. We expect those bodies to carefully review the proposed merger and to ensure that it is in the best interests of consumers and the Canadian and Alberta economies. Yesterday, I spoke at length to Rogers CEO Joe Natale and Shaw CEO Brad Shaw about the proposed merger. Rogers has made a number of positive commitments to increase jobs, service, and investment in Alberta if this goes through. If the proposal is approved, we would hold Rogers to those commitments, as they would be good news for Alberta's economy. The plan outlined by Rogers and Shaw would make significant net job growth in Alberta, especially in high-paying, high-tech jobs. This would further diversify our economy and build on recent major breakthroughs in Alberta's high-tech sector, like the Infosys expansion into Calgary announced just last week, which will create up to 2,000 great new jobs over the next 3 years. That's on top of a record year for venture capital investments and successful tech startup growth. The proposed merger of TELUS and Rogers also includes a commitment to significant expansion of 5G high-speed internet coverage across the province, which is good news for Alberta's rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, plus their local economies. Rogers has committed to make Calgary the company's western headquarters, and they've committed to creating 3,000 net new jobs in the West, about 60% or 1,800 of those net new jobs right here in Alberta. Most importantly, about 500 of those new jobs would be located here in Calgary at Rogers' proposed new National Centre for Technology and Engineering Excellence, which would be a big boost to our goal of making Alberta a hub for digital innovation, especially in the fast-growing wireless and telecommunications industries. Founded in Edmonton in 1966, I think it was more specifically Sherwood Park, by the late great entrepreneur J.R. Shaw. Shaw Industries is a made-in-Alberta success story that has been part of our community for decades. So obviously, we would strongly prefer that Rogers locate its national head office in Alberta. But by choosing Calgary as the home for this new National Centre for Technology and Engineering Excellence, it's further proof that Alberta's recovery plan is working and our economy is diversifying. We're also pleased to learn of the merged company's plan to expand Rogers' relationship with the University of Calgary and to maintain Shaw's strong support for local charities and community groups with, I think, an ongoing minimum $40 million support for those groups, and to support Indigenous-owned and operated internet service providers. The government of Alberta will closely monitor Rogers' regulatory filings, and we will likely make submissions to the regulatory agencies to defend the best interests of our economy and our consumers. In particularly, we'll seek to have the commitments that have been made to increased employment and investment We will seek to have those made as a condition of federal regulatory approval. If the proposed transaction is approved, Alberta's government will work closely with Rogers to ensure that the company keeps its commitment to a significant net increase in employment and in wireless infrastructure for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. We'll also work with Rogers to continue expanding investment and employment in Alberta in the years to come. And I appreciated my discussion with CEO Joe Natale, who is very bullish about the future for Alberta and the prospect of additional investment here. With the country's lowest taxes, lightest regulatory burden, youngest and best educated workforce, high quality of life, and low cost of living, we believe there is a powerful case for this merged national telecom leader to continue expanding its presence here in Alberta. Today's announcement follows on TELUS's 2019 announcement of its intention to invest $16 billion in Alberta over 5 years, supporting the hiring of 5,000 Albertans, including a focus on wireless applications in the delivery of healthcare and in growing the agricultural sector. So taken together, these investments would strengthen Alberta's place in the digital economy, diversifying our economy with more high-paying jobs. Now, with that, I'm going to make an embargoed statement about legislation being introduced in Alberta's Legislative Assembly this afternoon. I'm happy to take questions on both, but I just please ask that matters related to that legislation be held on embargo until the legislation is actually tabled by Minister Madu at approximately 3:30 this afternoon. So, as you know, in the last election, we committed to the most dramatic democratic reforms in Alberta history, to put Alberta voters in the driver's seat, to make it clear that at the end of the day, ordinary Alberta voters are the boss in our democracy. And if they lose faith in their elected representatives, that they can hold them to account in between elections. That's why we made a commitment to bring in a recall law that allows voters effectively to fire their elected representatives if they break public confidence. And so today we are introducing that legislation, keeping that commitment. In the last election, we announced that a United Conservative government would introduce a recall act based on the provisions contained in the British Columbia Recall and Initiative Act, which allows voters to remove their MLA and force a by-election if 40% of eligible voters in a constituency sign a recall petition no sooner than 18 months after an election. I'm quoting from the announcement in 2019. A legislative committee will be invited to study the bill, we said, consult widely, and make whatever amendments it deems appropriate to strike the right balance between maximizing accountability of MLAs to their constituents between elections while preventing frivolous efforts to reverse the result of elections. In fact, we appointed the Special Select Committee of Alberta's Legislature on Democratic Accountability to engage in that study prior to the introduction of this legislation to make sure that we got it right. I want to thank MLA for Cardston-Siksika, Joe Schow, who chaired that committee, its hearings, and all of those from both parties who participated. I want to thank the dozens of Albertans who made thoughtful submissions on the best way to ensure that this kind of additional democratic accountability works well here in Alberta. Now, some might say that this kind of legislation doesn't fit within our Westminster parliamentary system. I'd say that they must not be aware that British Columbia has had a recall law in place since 1991 for 30 years, and the United Kingdom Westminster Parliament adopted a recall act in 2015. Of course, dozens of U.S. states and many other democratic places around the world give this power ultimately to voters to hold their elected representatives to account. And so today we are keeping faith with that commitment. I want to thank other MLAs in the past who have brought this forward to the legislature through private members' bills, including Minister of Community of Culture and Multiculturalism, Leela here, who is an opposition MLA, brought forward a recall private members bill, and Drayton Valley, Devon, member of the legislature, Mark Smith, who's joining us here today. Mark, I think on two separate occasions, brought forward a bill on which this government legislation is based. I want to thank him and other colleagues for fighting for this kind of accountability for so many years. This legislation will not only cover members of the Alberta legislature, but also elected members of municipal councils, because local property owners and voters deserve the same kind of accountability from their local councillors, mayors, and reeves. And it will also apply to elected members of school boards across Alberta if they should do something that causes a loss of faith with their constituents, their electorate. This is an important step forward in our broader democratic reform agenda, which began just weeks after forming office, when we passed a motion in the legislature guaranteeing that members have free votes on matters not related to the confidence of the government, as well as passing a motion requiring MLAs to go to a by-election if they seek to cross the floor between parties to seek the consent of their local voters. More of our bold democratic reform agenda will be introduced in the days to come, as early as tomorrow, but I'm proud of this important step forward to strengthen democratic grassroots accountability in Alberta. And with that, I'll invite Minister of Justice Kaycee Madu to speak to his bill, and then we'll hear from the chair of the Democratic Accountability Committee, Joseph Schow, and MLA Smith, on whose private member's bill this legislation is based.
Thank you, Premier, and good afternoon. As Premier Kenney has explained, Bill 52, the Recall Act, would allow Albertans to initiate a process that could lead to removing and replacing MLAs, mayors, municipal councillors, and school board trustees before the end of their term. It is proposed that the window to begin the recall process will be 18 months after an election and close 6 months before an election. If an Albertan feels that the MLA in their constituency is not upholding their responsibilities, they can apply to the Chief Electoral Officer for a petition to recall them. The Albertan would then have 60 days to gather signatures from 40% of eligible voters in that constituency. They would then submit the petition to the Chief Electoral Officer, who would ensure the signatures are valid and the petition has reached the threshold of 40%. If the recall petition is successful, a vote would be held in that constituency to determine if the elected official should be recalled. If that vote is successful, the elected official will be removed and a by-election will be held. The process for recalling elected municipal officials and school board trustees would be slightly different. If an Albertan feels an elected official in their municipality or school division is not upholding their responsibilities, they could initiate a petition to recall that official. The applicant would then have 60 days for municipal officials or 120 days for school board trustees to gather signatures. In the case of municipal officials, they would need to collect signatures from 40% of the population of the municipality or ward and submit them to the Chief Administrative Officer. In the case of school trustees, the petitioner would need to submit signatures from 40% of eligible voters in that school division and submit them to the Secretary of the school board. In both cases, municipal and school trustee, if the signatures are valid and the petition has reached the threshold of 40%, the official will be removed. Following successful recalls, both the municipal and school recall processes require elections to be held to fill the new vacancy. The fact that Bill 52 grants Albertans the recall power ensures elected officials will remain responsive and accountable throughout their entire time in office, and not just on the campaign trail. Thank you, and now I would like to invite my caucus colleagues, the MLA Mark Smith for Drayton Valley, Devon, to provide his remarks.
Thank you, everyone. I first heard about the concept of recall when I was a member and a volunteer of the Reform Party of Canada in the 1980s and the 1990s. Recall was part of the slate of grassroots democratic initiatives that I came to believe would strengthen our system of democracy in Canada. Over the course of my 2 terms as an MLA in the Alberta legislature, I've had the privilege of trying to move recall legislation forward through 2 private members' bills, and finally to serve on the Select Special Committee on Democratic Accountability. Now, legislation is always about developing a consensus, and it starts with an idea that takes hold in the minds of its citizens. And if the idea has merit, it will gather enough momentum until it is brought before the People's House for their consideration. It has been a rare privilege to serve the people of Alberta and to have the opportunity to bring forward another layer of people power that will enhance the grassroots nature of our provincial democracy. Democracy moves at the pace of the people, and in this case, I believe the people are going to be well served should this bill become legislation. I want to recognize those who've had a hand historically in bringing forward the idea of recall, starting with Mr. Preston Manning and all of those reform volunteers that I worked with throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. I want to recognize all of the previous MLAs who have either brought forward recall legislation into this House in the recent past, or for those who have spoken in favor of it in the legislature and kept the idea alive. I want to thank my committee colleagues and the chair of the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee for their vision and for their hard work in the creation of this bill. And I want to thank the Premier and my caucus colleagues for their vision in realizing that at its heart, democracy is about empowering the people to act. Finally, to the people of Alberta, it is my pleasure to announce that should the recall bill pass through the legislature, that you will have an additional tool of democracy for your consideration. Use it wisely to strengthen our democracy. Use it to develop consensus. Use it to articulate a vision for the future, and use it to increase accountability. But most importantly, use it for the benefit of all Albertans. And now I pass the podium over to the chair of the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee, Mr. Joseph Schow.
Hello, my name is Joseph Schow. I'm the MLA for Cardston-Siksika, and I'm honored to be here today for such an important announcement. And I'm happy to speak about my role as the chair of the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee. In June of 2020, the Legislative Assembly passed Government Motion 25, which appointed the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee. And the purpose of this committee was to review the Elections Act and the Elections Finances and Disclosures Contributions Act, and to address the questions posed by the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. The committee's review of citizens' initiatives and recall involved a series of meetings that spanned over 6 months and were open to the public. These meetings began in the summer of July last year and concluded in the fall, with the final report being tabled in January. Throughout the public consultation stage, the committee heard from 16 presenters and received 33 written submissions. The committee also heard from 7 expert presenters that came from various backgrounds, such as the National Conference of State Legislatures, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, University of College of London Independent Commission on Referendums, and Mount Royal University. Representatives from the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General, along with Elections Alberta, attended the meetings to support the committee by providing technical expertise. During its final deliberations, the committee made 34 recommendations, 17 of which pertain to recall. And these recommendations included those pertaining to how many signatures are needed for a successful recall petition, How much time is allotted to collect those signatures? Who can apply for a petition and who can participate in a recall petition? These and others can be found in the committee's final report. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the presenters, the stakeholders, private citizens and committee members who were involved in this process. Albertans want to be able to hold their government to account. That is why we campaigned on democratic reforms such as the Recall Act, which will enhance voter ability to hold their elected representatives accountable. I am grateful to see the Alberta government and the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General taking these recommendations from the committee. I also like to thank them for moving us forward and one step closer to recall legislation. This is a promise made, and it is a promise kept. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Schow. We will now move to the phones for questions from the media. We'll do one question, one follow-up today. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Thank you. This first question is from Rick Bell, Calgary Sun.
Good afternoon. I do have one question, one follow-up. The one question is about the leadership review, and then the second will be about recall. Premier, there is now a review of your leadership promised for 2022. What do you say to those people in the UCP ranks who are still actively pushing for an earlier review, as in a review sometime this year and sometime not far along the line, much earlier, sooner rather than later? And then I'll also have the second question.
Thanks, Rick. So, as you know, the United Conservative Party at our AGM just a couple of months ago in November passed a number of constitutional amendments. We're a new party, so they're still adding to the kind of internal governance rules of the party, one of which is a pretty typical thing, is for delegates at a convention to have a chance to vote on the leadership. So that's normal. I supported that, and our elected provincial board for the United Conservative Party passed a motion, I think by a vote of 16-1 on Friday, to schedule that, as would normally be the case in our 2022 AGM. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't think it would make much sense for us as a party to be focused on internal politics in the middle of multiple crises that we as a government have to manage. I think Albertans want and expect their elected leaders to lead through this crisis to get us to the other side. Thankfully, we're getting closer every single day. With the vaccines, with the return of economic growth, with the growing body of good news about Alberta's renewal. So we look forward to, and not just, as I've said before, we don't just see the light at the end of the tunnel through the COVID crisis, we actually see the end of the tunnel. And our focus right now as a government, as a caucus, as a team, is on getting the job done, protecting lives and livelihoods, not internal politics.
And I guess I just need a clarification, so I guess I'll use my supplementary for that. But what do you say to the people who are still saying, no, we want, and these are in your party, we want the review now. Our constituency association wants to send a resolution to the party saying that we want that leadership now. What do you tell them to perhaps get them to accept the decision that was made on Friday? How do you convince them that this is not the time?
Well, our party board is elected, and they're discharged with making decisions of this nature. They made that as a 16-1 decision. Albertans expect this government and me as Premier to be focused on getting us through these crises, on protecting lives and livelihoods, not on being distracted by internal politics. So we're going to stay focused on the huge responsibility we have and not be distracted. We're going to get the job done in terms of protecting lives and livelihoods and moving on with economic recovery.
Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Thank you. James Keller, Globe and Mail.
Hi, Premier. Back to the Shaw-Roger deal. I know that you're saying this is a net benefit. Just there will be a loss of another head office in Calgary, though. How much of a blow is that to the province, even just sort of psychologically, at the time when we're trying to be attracting head offices rather than lose them?
Well, as I said, we would prefer that Rogers, under this merger, locate its national headquarters here in Alberta. and we honor the history of Shaw in helping to build Alberta's modern economy. Let me say, though, James, I would be a lot more concerned if this represented a net loss of jobs. But to the contrary, Rogers is making very strong and public commitments, which they reiterated to me privately, that this will lead to a significant net increase in good-paying jobs in Alberta and a significant increase, multi-billion-dollar increase in investment for their wireless and high-speed infrastructure in this province. So when you take all of that into account, and we intend to pursue those commitments, we will seek to have them a condition of federal regulatory approval, and we have every intention of holding Rogers to account to implement those commitments, including, most importantly, the creation of the National Centre for Excellence in Engineering and Technology. That alone would be a huge boost to the growing tech, innovation, and digital economy in this province. So with those commitments, this would be a net plus for jobs and the economy in Alberta. I have great respect for Shaw, as I've said, for their history and presence in this province. But as you know, they've been struggling to capitalize, to pay for the rollout of their 5G spectrum through major infrastructure investments. If this combined company is approved, it will have the capital depth, the ability to make those investments, and they're committing to $2.5 billion in additional investments in the 5G network in Western Canada. I'm told that will be mainly in Alberta, and a $1 billion fund for rural, remote, and Indigenous connectivity. This would be a game changer, together with similar investments by TELUS, to connect our rural communities to the digital economy of the future. So, I would prefer that their national headquarters and not just their Western headquarters were located in Calgary. But my focus, James, is jobs, jobs, and jobs. And these commitments equal more high-paying jobs in Alberta.
James, do you have a follow-up?
Just unrelated, back to the leadership review. Do you have a threshold in mind for what would constitute a successful vote for your leadership? I know most leaders put it at a lot higher than 50%.
My focus right now is, as I said before, not on internal politics. It's on getting focused on protecting lives and livelihoods during the crises that our government is responsible for addressing right now. That's our immediate focus, and we're not going to get distracted by internal politics.
Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Thank you. Bill Fortier, CTV.
Hi, this is for the Premier and the Justice Minister. I'm wondering when you hope to see this recall legislation in effect, and if you don't have a date in mind, will it be at least 6 months before the next provincial election?
I'll take that, Kaycee. Thanks. So the answer is, first of all, it has to, of course, go through legislative debate. We anticipate that it will be adopted by the legislature, certainly with government caucus voting in favor, sometime this spring. Then it would take a period of time to develop the regulations to support the law, as well for Elections Alberta to tool up so they could actually administer any prospective recall petitions. So I would expect that it would be proclaimed into law and be operational later this year. When exactly, we don't know. It depends in part on how much debate time this takes in the legislature, but certainly later this year and well before 6 months prior to the next election.
And if I'm getting a follow-up here, I'm not sure if I am.
You are.
$500 is the amount set out for municipal or school board officials to start this petition. There's no fee set yet for MLAs. Do you suspect, or would you like to see it around the same, or should it be more expensive?
Kaycee, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, thank you, Premier. So obviously we have not made a determination on what that amount would look like, and that is the reason why we have a regulation-making power embedded in the legislation. And it is at that particular point in time that we will make a determination as to the appropriate amount of fee. But suffice it to say that it wouldn't be too far away from, from the fee payable at the municipal or school board trustee level.
Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Thank you. Chris Varco, Calgary Herald.
Hi, this is a question for the Premier. Premier, when you're talking about the Shaw-Rogers matter, can you be more specific? What kind of assurances are you looking for from the company? In other words, how are you going to ensure that the company keeps its promise once the deal is done? And is Alberta's support contingent on receiving those assurances in terms of you making any representations to the Competition Bureau or the CRTC?
Well, on the second question, the answer is yes, absolutely. We would only support this proposed merger if it's absolutely clear that the new company, Rogers, would implement the big commitments that they're making in this package here today. Commitments to create 1,800 and at least 1,800 net new jobs in Alberta. To invest at least $2.5 billion in 5G infrastructure in Western Canada, with a huge share of that coming to Alberta, and all of the other commitments that they've made. So we're going to closely monitor their regulatory filings with the Competition Bureau and the CRTC. We hope that they will include these commitments within those filings, and we may very well make our own submissions to those regulatory bodies, if necessary, asking that they make regulatory approval conditional on the company implementing these jobs and investment commitments. Now, I don't mean to suggest for a second that they're being cute about this. I had an hour-long conversation with Rogers CEO Joe Natale yesterday and Shaw CEO Brad Shaw, and I think they're absolutely certain that they intend to do this. In fact, Mr. Natale indicated that there could very well be additional investments and operations located in Alberta in the future. But this is a starting point. We appreciate that commitment, but there's no way I'd be standing here talking about this as potentially good news if we didn't have a commitment to significant net job creation. And I do want to salute Rogers for having identified Alberta as the ideal place to locate their new proposed National Centre for Excellence in Engineering and Technology. This would be beginning with 500 jobs in high-tech engineering positions. That helps to take us one step further to that so-called ecosystem in the digital or tech sector in this province that will hyper-boost our efforts to diversify Alberta's economy. So we're bullish on those commitments, and we intend to hold that company to the commitments that they're making.
And I just have a follow-up on that. When you said that you spoke to Rogers CEO Joe Natale yesterday, did you discuss them moving their corporate headquarters to Alberta? You talked in the past about using the corporate income tax rate being decreased to the lowest in the country to try and bring companies here. I'm wondering, where did that conversation go, and did you get any receptivity to it?
Sure. I pitched him on that yesterday. It's not the first time I've done so, and we'll continue to pitch Rogers and any major employer across Canada. If they want to move to benefit from the lowest tax rates, the most highly educated and youngest workforce in a province with the highest quality of living, with a substantial cost saving on operations and the cost of life versus, say, on Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, this is the place to be. We'll continue to make that case to them and to other companies.
Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Ian Bexty, Rebel News.
A question to the Premier, thanks for taking it. Can Albertans take this as sort of a signal that the government is looking to put COVID sort of behind you and start dealing with the policy and legislation and campaign promises that you made 2 or 3 years ago? It is now, I suppose. Is this a signal that you're looking to sort of reset?
Well, I wouldn't say reset, because in fact this is implementing part of our original agenda, and I would say that We have never stopped with that, right? Last year, Alberta's legislature sat far longer, far more days, and passed far more bills than any legislature in Canada, and significantly more than the federal parliament. Now, a lot of that was COVID-related actions, policies, legislation, funding, etc. But an awful lot of it was grinding through the implementation of the huge and detailed platform we ran on in the 2019 election. At last count, I believe we have now substantially or completely implemented nearly 75% of the platform commitments we ran on. I'll tell you that it was originally our intention to like our first year was obviously focused on economic priorities. That was the key theme on which we ran in the last election. We had originally planned to go forward with some of the democratic reform items in the spring of 2020. But obviously we got sideswiped by COVID. The legislature sittings were disrupted. We had to bring in different kinds of emergency legislation. And quite frankly, I don't think Albertans would have understood the government talking about issues like democratic reform at the height of the pandemic. So we then said, okay, well, we want to get moving on this stuff. That's why we appointed the special legislature committee chaired by Joseph Schow there to consult Albertans per our platform commitment, and now bringing forward the legislation. So I wish this had come forward about a year ago, but I also wish COVID didn't happen and it hadn't become a huge focus, of course, for our energies in the past year. So you'll see more of the kind of commitments in the platform coming forward in this spring session. And we hope that by June, that will be edging close to 90% implementation of the platform.
And do you have a follow-up?
Now, you did mention that you hope to have this sort of rolling by the time during this legislature. So, because you made some pretty condemning statements about your former MLA from Lesser Slave Lake, would you support a recall campaign to remove that former UCP MLA? And I only ask because of the statements you made about the quality of his work output.
You know what? I'm not going to. That's for his constituents. Recall is between constituents and their representative, not for me as a leader of a party that he is. He's not in our caucus, so it's totally up to his constituents. I do know that a couple of the town councils in his riding actually passed motions last fall. Calling on the government to expedite adoption of the recall law because they wanted to trigger it with respect to their local MLA. So if you want an opinion on that, if I were you, I'd call the mayors of Slave Lake or High Prairie and see what they think about that.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions. Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Janet French, CBC.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. For the Premier, I'm curious, the Special Democratic Accountability Committee actually recommended in its report that the government allow 90 days to petition for removal of an MLA, not 60. So I'm just curious why you did not follow that recommendation.
Good question, Kaycee. I must confess it's been 3 months since I read that report. We took on board those recommendations. They weren't the only factors that we looked at. There was this went through our member policy committee and caucus. Kaycee, do you have a recollection as to how we settled on 60?
Yes. Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Janet, for that question. So we took into consideration provisions in BC and in other jurisdictions to make a determination as to what that appropriate number of days will be, to strike the right balance between what is required to obtain the required 40% threshold. And we landed at 60%. And we landed at 60 days.
Okay. You also had folks who testified before the committee saying if it's going to be 60 days, that there should be a lower threshold, that it should be 25% or 30%. So I'm just wondering if you could just explain the reasoning behind how you arrived at 60 days, and also could you repeat these answers in French if possible, Mr. Premier?
Okay.
So again, the committee made their recommendations. There were people that appeared before the committee that had all kinds of views. We had jurisdictions that have recall legislation in place in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. Just like their recommendation with respect to the percentage, At the end of the day, we had to take a look at all of those things to make a determination as to what is the appropriate policy here to strike the right balance. And I think that is what we have done.
Okay, I'll try in French. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just found what Kaycee's alluding to here in the British Columbia legislation. I'm quoting from section 20.A. If the petition is not submitted in accordance with section 23, 60 days after the date on which the petition was issued. So it's a 60-day framework in the BC legislation. And Janet, if you look at the announcement that we made in 2019, just prior to the election, we said that the United Conservative government would introduce a recall act based on the provisions contained in the BC Recall and Initiative Act. So that's the basis on which we made the electoral commitment. That's the provision in the BC statute that we're replicating here. I'll try that in French. Pour dire tout simplement qu'on a fait un engagement auprès des électeurs albertains d'avoir une loi de recall basée sur le précédent en Colombie-Britannique qui existe depuis 1991. Et dans ce projet de loi-là, c'est un délai de 60 jours pour la pétition, les signatures sur une question d'une recall sur un député. Alors, nous avons effectivement répliqué les balises du projet de loi en Colombie-Britannique à cet égard.
Operator, can you please put through our final caller?
Thank you. The final caller is Mirna Vukic, Radio Canada.
Yes, hi, thank you for taking my question. For the Premier, if you could once again answer in both English and French. About the legislation, why a successful petition needs to be followed by a vote in the case of an MLA, but not in the case of a municipal or a school official? Are you worried about the message it might send to the population to have one set of rules for your MLAs and one set of rules for the other ones? And how will you avoid any abuse of this process, I guess?
Sure. First of all, I don't think abuse is a question. There's pretty clear legal standards, and all of this will be overseen and implemented in the case of MLAs by the Chief Electoral Officer, and then, of course, in the case of school boards and municipal officials by relevant nonpartisan government agencies. I think that the province has, frankly, a better infrastructure to administer special elections of this nature. But Kaycee or Joe, do you have any other input as to how the local officials are not subject to the separate recall election?
No, thank you, Premier. Premier, I think you are on the right path with the comment there. This is as a consequence of the unique circumstances at the municipal level and at the school board trustee level. As you know, there are different legislation that governs municipally elected leaders, and there are different legislation that governs, school board trustees. And so this is taking into consideration the unique circumstances of the legislation that we're dealing with here. But that said, also is also the fact that the provincial government, we have more capacity, and the recognition that at that particular level, the Chief Electoral Officer have got more resources at his disposal to be able to, administer those elections.
Et si vous voulez en français, pour dire tout simplement que la province a mieux. La province a plus de ressources, comme le bureau d'officier des élections, pour administrer les élections spéciales à la suite d'une pétition. Et c'est particulièrement les petites municipalités, les petites commissions scolaires ont beaucoup moins de ressources. Alors c'est un processus plus simplifié à cet égard. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Merci beaucoup. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.